The atmosphere inside the luxurious restaurant was nothing short of extraordinary. Soft jazz played in the background. The gentle clinking of fine china filled the air, and the dim lighting highlighted the exquisite decor of the grand room. It was a night like any other at the Ivory Peak, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Its patrons were rich, powerful, and accustomed to a life of indulgence. But there, at a corner table by the large windows overlooking the city lights, sat someone who had never belonged to this world, at least not yet. Jason Blackwood, a man in his early 30s, exuded the confidence of someone who had already conquered the business world. His tailored suit was sharp, his watch gleamed under the soft lighting, and his eyes held the quiet intensity of someone who had seen the heights of success. He wasn't the type to casually enjoy his meal. Every move he made seemed calculated, deliberate, as if he were constantly evaluating the world around him, analyzing every interaction, every gesture. But tonight, something was different. He was here with his younger brother, David, who seemed like the exact opposite of Jason in every way. David was more laid back, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, and his messy hair hinted at a carefree attitude. The two brothers had always shared a bond, though it was often strained by their differing perspectives on life. While Jason had always been about the hustle, the grind, and the power plays, David was more concerned with helping others, with making meaningful connections, and finding purpose beyond material wealth. Jason glanced at David, his eyes narrowing slightly. His brother had always been the idealist, the one who believed in helping others without expecting anything in return. He'd often dismissed David's approach to life as naive, believing that success could only come through ruthless ambition. But tonight, David was acting differently. His eyes were focused on a waitress who had just brought their drinks to the table. A young woman with blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun and eyes that seemed to hold a quiet strength. Her name was Emma. Jason watched as his brother's gaze lingered on her, not in a way that made him uncomfortable, but with a curiosity that felt almost out of place. David wasn't the type to show interest in someone like her. She wasn't part of their world. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, and she certainly wasn't someone they'd normally associate with. But there was something about her that was different, something that intrigued David. Jason leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished wood of the table. He had been watching David, observing his every move. But it wasn't just Emma that had caught his attention. It was the way David had reacted to her. He seemed genuinely interested, almost drawn to her in a way that Jason hadn't seen before. As the night went on, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He'd expected David to get lost in the conversation, to focus on the meal, but his eyes kept drifting back to Emma. She had just brought over the check when something unexpected happened. David had leaned forward and, in a quiet voice, asked her how her night was going. It was a simple question, but there was something genuine about it, something that made Jason feel uneasy. It wasn't like David to show this level of concern for someone who wasn't a part of his life. David's words seemed to catch Emma off guard. She hesitated for a moment before responding with a soft smile. "It's going well, thank you. But I'm actually working another shift after this, so it's going to be a long night." Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying weariness that Jason could sense, even from where he sat. Jason's eyes narrowed. He had never really thought much about the lives of the people who worked in places like this. They were simply part of the background, moving in and out of his world without ever leaving an impression. But tonight, as he watched his brother speak with Emma, he felt a strange sense of discomfort. Emma's shift was ending, and she began to gather her things, preparing to leave. David stood up suddenly, a look of determination on his face. He walked over to Emma, his footsteps echoing in the quiet restaurant. Jason watched, intrigued by his brother's unusual behavior. It was almost as if David had forgotten about him completely, focused solely on the young waitress. Emma smiled politely at David as he approached, but there was a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Is there something else I can do for you?" she asked, her tone light but guarded. David hesitated, looking as if he were searching for the right words. "I just wanted to say, I know you're working hard tonight, and I just wanted to make sure you're okay. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." His words were simple, but they held a sincerity that Jason hadn't expected. There was a softness in David's voice, a kindness that seemed to disarm Emma, making her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. Emma's eyes softened. She looked at David for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's really kind of you." But there was something else in her eyes, something that hinted at a hidden struggle, a story she wasn't ready to share. Jason could sense the tension in the air, the unspoken exchange between his brother and Emma. He watched as David's face remained gentle, his expression soft but insistent. It was clear that David wasn't just offering sympathy. He was offering something deeper, something more personal. As Emma walked away, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle over him. He watched as she disappeared into the back of the restaurant, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. David returned to the table, his face unreadable. "Why did you do that?" Jason finally asked, his voice low but steady. David turned to him, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Do what?" "You know what I mean," Jason said, his gaze fixed on his brother. "You barely know her. Why would you go out of your way to ask her if she's okay? What's going on?" David paused, looking at Jason as if considering how to answer. "She's just a person, Jason. Just because she's a waitress doesn't mean she's invisible." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, an edge that Jason hadn't expected. Jason sat back in his chair, trying to process what David had said. He had never understood his brother's need to help others, to connect with people outside their social circle. It was almost as if David didn't care about status, wealth, or power. He simply cared about people. It was a quality Jason had always admired, even if he didn't fully understand it. "Do you think you can just fix everything?" Jason finally asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. David looked at him, his expression soft but firm. "I don't think I can fix everything, but I can try to make a difference, even if it's just for one person." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jason felt a strange sensation stir within him, a mix of admiration and discomfort. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to get things done. But David seemed to do something that Jason had never been able to. He connected with people on a deeper level, a level that Jason couldn't quite reach. It was then that the door to the restaurant opened, and a man in a suit entered. Jason didn't recognize him at first, but there was something familiar about him. The man scanned the room, his eyes landing on David and Jason. His presence was commanding, and there was a sense of authority in the way he moved through the restaurant. The man approached their table with purpose, and when Jason looked up, he immediately recognized him. It was Robert Hayes, the owner of one of the largest corporations in the country, a man who had made billions in investments in real estate. He was a regular at the Ivory Peak, and his wealth and influence were unparalleled. But what caught Jason off guard wasn't Robert's sudden appearance. It was the way he was looking at David. There was something in Robert's eyes, something that made Jason feel uneasy. It was as if Robert recognized something in David that Jason hadn't seen before. Robert stopped in front of their table, his sharp gaze flickering from Jason to David. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," Robert said, his voice smooth but carrying an air of authority. "You're David Blackwood, aren't you?" David looked up, surprised. "Yes, that's me. Do I know you?" Robert smiled, though it was more of a calculated grin than a friendly gesture. "I've heard of you. You're a philanthropist, aren't you? You've been involved in several charity projects, haven't you?" His tone was polite, but there was an undertone of something darker in his words. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He knew the name Robert Hayes. It was a name associated with power and manipulation, a man who wasn't above using people to further his own interests. But now, it seemed that Robert had taken an interest in David. David stood up, his gaze steady. "Yes, I've been involved in a few projects. I believe in giving back, especially when you have the means to do so." Robert's smile widened, though there was something calculating in his eyes. "I admire that," he said, his voice smooth. "In fact, I have an opportunity that might interest you." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't trust Robert Hayes. There was something about him that felt dangerous, something that made Jason uneasy. "What kind of opportunity?" David asked, his curiosity piqued. Robert leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I can offer you a chance to expand your reach, to have a much bigger impact. I have connections, resources, and influence. Together, we could do something monumental, something that could change the world." Jason watched as David considered Robert's words. There was a spark in David's eyes, a flicker of something that Jason couldn't quite place. Was David really considering this? Was he about to step into a world that he had no idea how to navigate? Before David could respond, something unexpected happened. Emma appeared again, walking past their table, but this time she stopped. Her eyes were focused on Robert Hayes, and there was something in her expression that made Jason's stomach tighten. Emma's eyes were filled with a silent understanding, and for a split second, it felt as if she knew something about Robert that neither of the Blackwoods did. She paused, meeting Robert's gaze, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You're not who you pretend to be, Robert." The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth. And just like that, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Everything had changed in the span of a single moment. The tension in the room was palpable. Robert Hayes, the billionaire whose name commanded fear and respect, stood frozen for a brief moment. His eyes flickered with something Jason couldn't quite read. Surprise, anger, perhaps even recognition. But whatever it was enough to send a chill down his spine. Emma, the young waitress, had said something that clearly struck a nerve. She didn't seem like someone who could take on a man like Robert Hayes, but her words had landed with the force of a thunderclap in the otherwise serene atmosphere of the Ivory Peak. David stood motionless, his eyes locked on Emma. Jason could see the conflict in his brother's expression. It was as though he was trying to understand the situation, but couldn't quite make sense of it. Who was this woman? How did she know Robert? And why did it seem like she had just thrown a grenade into the middle of their quiet dinner? Robert's hand tightened into a fist, his jaw clenching as he slowly turned his gaze toward Emma. He took a deep breath, his features smoothing out, and his voice dropped an octave, becoming smooth and measured. "You're mistaken, my dear," Robert said, his tone so polite it almost sounded rehearsed, as though he had used this same line countless times to dismiss people who dared to challenge him. "I'm afraid you don't know what you're talking about." Emma didn't back down. She stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes meeting Robert's with an intensity that was unsettling. "I know exactly who you are, Robert Hayes. The man who hides behind money and power. The man who thinks he can control everything around him. But you don't control me." Her voice was quiet, but there was a defiance in it that made Robert's facade crack, if only for a moment. Jason couldn't believe what he was hearing. What was going on here? He'd known Robert Hayes for years. He was a ruthless businessman, someone who played the game of power with an unmatched level of cunning. And yet here was Emma, a seemingly ordinary waitress, confronting him as if she had nothing to lose. Her words were cutting, but it was the way she said them, so calm, so assured, that made them dangerous. Robert's smile faltered for a split second before he regained control. He shifted his weight and stepped toward Emma, his presence dominating the space between them. "I suggest you watch your tone," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Emma didn't flinch. She merely stood there, unblinking, as if daring him to make the next move. "No, Robert," she said quietly, her voice carrying an undeniable weight. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jason watched as Robert took a step back, his eyes narrowing, calculating. He seemed to be sizing up Emma, but there was an unmistakable shift in his demeanor. He no longer appeared in control. His calm, collected exterior was beginning to crack, revealing the uncertainty and discomfort that lay beneath. But before anyone could react further, David stood up from the table, his chair scraping noisily against the floor. "Enough, Robert," David said, his voice firm but not hostile. It was as if he had made a decision in that very moment, one that he didn't fully understand yet, but one that he felt compelled to act on. "I don't care what your connections or your money can do. This isn't about that." Jason shot David a look, his heart pounding in his chest. What was his brother doing? Was he seriously standing up to Robert Hayes, the man who could end him with a single word? It was insanity. David didn't have the resources or the power to take on someone like Robert. But something was different tonight. David wasn't speaking like the man who had once been content to stay in the background. He wasn't trying to please anyone or conform to anyone's expectations. He was simply speaking his truth, and it was a truth that seemed to resonate with Emma. Jason opened his mouth to protest, to tell David to sit back down before things got even more out of hand. But before he could speak, Emma stepped forward. She didn't say a word to anyone, but her presence was enough to stop Robert in his tracks. She locked eyes with him, her gaze unwavering, and for the first time in a long while, Robert Hayes seemed uncertain. The billionaire, the man who had built empires and toppled those who stood in his way, was suddenly facing something he couldn't control, a woman who saw right through him. The room had grown still. No one was speaking. The soft murmur of the other patrons had ceased. Even the jazz playing in the background seemed to fade into silence. All eyes were on the trio standing at the center of the room, Robert, Emma, and David. Jason felt a cold sweat forming on his brow as the silence stretched on. "What's going on here?" Jason asked, his voice sharp with a mixture of confusion and fear. His mind was racing. He needed to understand what had just happened. "Who are you, Emma? And why are you standing up to Robert like this?" Emma turned to Jason, her face softening ever so slightly. "I'm someone who's seen through Robert's lies for years," she said, her voice steady. "I used to work for him, Jason. I know how he operates. He's the kind of man who thinks he can destroy anyone who gets in his way. But I refuse to be another victim of his manipulation." Jason's eyes widened. "You worked for him? How? What happened?" Emma looked down for a moment, her expression darkening, as though the memories were still too painful to confront. "I worked for him in his private charity organization," she said quietly. "At first, I thought I was doing good. I thought I was helping people. But then I started to see the truth. Robert uses the charity to launder money, to cover up his real intentions. People like me, people who care about the cause, are nothing more than pawns in his game." David's jaw clenched as he absorbed Emma's words. Jason, on the other hand, felt his world tilting. The man he had admired, the man who had seemed untouchable, was suddenly exposed. Robert Hayes wasn't just a businessman. He was a criminal, a master manipulator who had been hiding behind the facade of philanthropy for years. And Emma, this waitress, had been the one to uncover it. Robert's expression hardened, his face a mask of anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a disgruntled employee. No one will believe you." But Emma didn't back down. "Maybe no one will believe me, Robert. Maybe they'll all turn a blind eye, like they always do. But I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore. I'm going to expose you for who you really are." The words hung in the air, as heavy as the silence that followed. Jason's heart was pounding in his chest. This was all happening too fast. He hadn't expected any of this. His brother, his quiet, idealistic brother, was caught up in something that could destroy him. Destroy all of them. And Emma was the catalyst, the one who had set everything in motion. But what would happen next? What was Robert going to do? Robert's eyes flicked to David, then to Jason, as if deciding who to address next. "You think you can stop me?" Robert asked, his voice dangerously calm. "You think you can challenge me? I've built empires, crushed rivals, and destroyed anyone who has ever tried to stand in my way. What makes you think you're any different?" David stepped closer to Robert, his gaze unwavering. "Because I'm not trying to build an empire or crush anyone. I'm not like you, Robert. I believe in something more than just power and control. I believe in the truth." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Robert seemed to hesitate. His eyes flicked from David to Emma, and something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but Jason could see it. Robert was realizing that his usual tactics, the intimidation, the manipulation, weren't going to work here. These two weren't afraid of him. "I'll give you one last chance," Robert said, his voice cold and final. "Walk away. Leave this place, and I'll forget all of this ever happened." David didn't flinch. "I'm not going anywhere, Robert." And neither is Emma. For a moment, the room was utterly still. It was as if the world had come to a standstill, waiting for someone to make the next move. Jason felt his pulse quicken. Everything was spiraling out of control. But there was no turning back now. His brother had taken a stand, and Emma had opened Pandora's box. What would happen when the truth finally came to light? Would Robert Hayes retaliate? Would he go as far as to destroy them? As if answering his unspoken question, Robert turned on his heel and stalked toward the door. But as he reached the threshold, he paused. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes dark with barely contained rage. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You've made a dangerous mistake." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Robert was threatening them, and for the first time, Jason wasn't sure whether they had made the right choice. Was David's idealism enough to take down someone like Robert? And Emma, who was she really? What was her role in all of this? How had she known the truth about Robert Hayes? The door to the restaurant closed with a soft thud, leaving the three of them standing in the dim light, uncertain of what would come next.